If you'd told the 12-year-old version of me that I'd one day stand in front of a full orchestra with my name printed on the program, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I wasn't even allowed to believe I was good at anything. This is the story of how I became a conductor despite my parents, not because of them, and how, 20 years later, they ended up sitting in an audience they had no idea I'd be standing in front of. Stay with me to the end, and if this story moves you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needed to hear it today. My name is Odaliz Marchetti. I'm 36 years old. I live outside Portland now, in a small house with a garden I'm slowly learning to keep alive. But I grew up in a river town in Ohio where my family had run a hardware store for 3 generations. In that house, there was exactly one acceptable future. You worked the counter, you learned the register, and eventually the store became yours. My older cousin Neil, who came to live with us after his own parents split up when I was 7, was groomed for that future from the moment he could count change back correctly. I was groomed for something else entirely, to stay quiet, take up as little space as possible, and not cause trouble. I found the violin by accident when I was 9 years old, buried under a box of Christmas decorations in a case that hadn't been opened in over a decade. It had belonged to my grandmother, who died before I was born and who nobody in my family talked about much. The case was covered in a layer of dust so thick it left a print of my hand when I lifted the lid. Inside, the wood had a strange, warm glow to it, even in the dim attic light, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. My father found me an hour later, still sitting cross-legged on the attic floor with the violin balanced across my knees, plucking at the strings without any idea what I was doing. I expected him to be angry. He was angry about most things that involved me touching something without asking. Instead, he just stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the violin like it belonged to a version of the family he didn't like to think about. "You can keep it," he finally said. "Just don't make a fuss about lessons or anything. We don't have money for that kind of thing." I didn't understand yet that this was the closest thing to a blessing I would ever get from him. I said thank you 3 times before he left the room. I taught myself the basics that year from library books: how to hold the bow, how to tune by ear using a pitch pipe I found in the school music closet, how to read the first few lines of a beginner's method book I renewed so many times the librarian eventually just let me keep it. A teacher at school, Mr. Alvarez, noticed me practicing scales in an empty classroom during lunch one day and stood in the doorway listening for almost 5 minutes before I noticed him. He asked who was teaching me. When I told him nobody was, he offered to give me free lessons after school twice a week in the band room. He was the first adult who ever told me I had something worth developing. He used to say, standing behind me with his arms crossed while I worked through a passage for the 10th time, "Talent is common, Odalys. Discipline is rare. You happen to have both, and that terrifies people who have neither." I didn't fully understand what he meant until years later. For 4 years, Mr. Alvarez was the only person who treated my music like it mattered. My parents treated it like a hobby that occasionally needed to be sacrificed for something more important. If the store was short-staffed on a Saturday, my lesson got canceled without discussion. My father would just say, "Alvarez will understand," and that was the end of it. If Neil had a Little League game, the whole family went, cheered from the bleachers, took photographs that later went up on the refrigerator. If I had a school recital, my mother would show up 20 minutes late, if she showed up at all, and sit near the exit so she could leave quickly afterward. I used to watch the door during recitals instead of watching my own hands, hoping she'd come in before my piece ended. She rarely did. There's one recital in particular I still think about more than any other. I was 13, playing a short solo piece I'd worked on for nearly 3 months, the hardest thing I'd attempted up to that point. Mr. Alvarez had arranged for me to open the evening, a small honor for a student that young. I stood backstage in the wings of the school auditorium, watching the door at the back of the room every few seconds, counting the empty seats in the 3rd row where my parents were supposed to be. They never came. Neil did, dragged along by my mother's sister on a night my aunt happened to be babysitting him, and he clapped louder than anyone in the room, which somehow made the absence of my actual parents feel even larger. I played the piece anyway. I didn't miss a note. Nobody in my house asked me how it went. When I was 16, Mr. Alvarez recorded me playing through a demanding solo piece on an old cassette recorder he brought from home, and submitted the tape to a summer program at a youth conservatory 2 states away, the kind of program that actually got serious teenage musicians, noticed by real regional orchestras, sometimes even university scouts. Getting accepted into the program itself wasn't guaranteed. Getting invited to audition in person, which was the first hurdle, was already rare enough that Mr. Alvarez treated it like a genuine possibility rather than a long shot. The invitation letter arrived in March. I know the exact month because Mr. Alvarez called the program office himself to confirm it had been mailed, and wrote the date down in the little spiral notebook he used to track my progress. Weeks passed. Then a month. I checked the mailbox every day after school, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that of course I hadn't made the cut, that people like me didn't get invited to things like that. Eventually, I stopped checking. I told Mr. Alvarez I must not have made it. He looked confused, genuinely confused, the kind of look that should have told me something was wrong. But he didn't push it, and I didn't ask him to. I didn't learn the truth until I was 22 years old at my cousin Neil's wedding. 3 drinks into a rare moment of loose-lipped honesty from my father. We were standing near the dessert table and he was telling some story about the store, and almost as an aside, he mentioned that music camp thing you were all worked up about back in high school. I told him I didn't remember being that worked up about it. He shrugged and said, "I figured it'd just get your hopes up over nothing. Musicians don't have real jobs, Odalus. I was doing you a favor, taking care of it before it became a whole thing." I asked him what he meant by taking care of it. He explained, casually, like he was describing a decision about which brand of nails to stock, that a letter had come from me that spring, that he'd opened it because it looked official, read enough to see what it was, and thrown it in the trash before I got home from school. He said he didn't see the point in me finding out about something that would only distract me from more practical things. My mother was standing right there the entire time. She said nothing. She just refilled her wine glass and looked out at the dance floor. I left that wedding early. I didn't speak to either of them again for almost 6 years. I moved to Chicago at 23 with $400 in cash, a duffel bag of clothes, and a second-hand viola I'd traded my grandmother's violin for, a decision that made practical sense at the time, since violists were in shorter supply at city auditions, but one that still catches in my chest when I think about it too long. I had one address in my pocket, my mother's estranged sister, my Aunt Corinne, a woman my parents had cut off almost a decade earlier for being difficult, which I would later learn actually meant she'd refused to go along with my father's version of how a family was supposed to behave. Corinne opened her door without a single question about why I'd shown up with a duffel bag and an instrument case at 11 at night. She worked overnight shifts as a nurse and slept during the day, so for the first few months I basically lived on her couch in shifts around her schedule, learning to practice quietly with a mute clamped onto the strings while she slept. She left notes on the fridge in handwriting that looked eerily like my mother's, which used to unsettle me. "Practice loud tonight. The downstairs neighbors are worse than you." She was the first adult in my family who ever asked me what I wanted out loud and then actually waited long enough to hear the answer. I auditioned for 11 ensembles that first year in the city. I got into exactly one, the second viola section of a mid-tier regional orchestra that paid so little per rehearsal that I kept a second job at a 24-hour laundromat, folding strangers' clothes until 1 in the morning some nights, then getting up for an 8 a.m. rehearsal call. I failed the audition I'd actually moved to Chicago for, a prestigious conservatory-adjacent training program that took only 6 string players a year. I remember standing outside the audition hall afterward, calling Corinne from a payphone because my cell service had been cut off that week for non-payment, certain I should just quit and take the next bus home. "Going home isn't the same thing as giving up," she said, "but for you right now tonight it would be." I didn't go home. I went back to the laundromat and worked the closing shift instead, folding towels until my hands stopped shaking. That same year I met Marcus Delane, a percussionist subbing in the same regional orchestra, filling in for a timpanist who'd broken his wrist skiing. Marcus had grown up moving between foster placements across 3 counties and had a strange, precise way of reading a room that made him an unlikely but perfect friend for someone as guarded as I'd become. We started getting coffee after Thursday rehearsals, mostly because we were both usually the last 2 people left in the building. He was the one who first told me, flatly, over a cup of burnt gas station coffee, that I conducted with my whole body even when I wasn't holding a baton, that I cued entrances with my shoulders during rehearsal breaks without realizing it, that I heard structure in a piece the way other string players only heard melody. "You're not a violist who's decent," he told me one night after a particularly rough rehearsal where the conductor had lost control of the tempo twice. "You're a conductor who happens to also play viola." I laughed it off completely. He didn't laugh with me. 6 months later, without telling me first, he forwarded me a posting for a graduate conducting fellowship at a music school 2 states over, the kind of program I never would have considered applying to on my own because in my head conducting was still something other people with different childhoods than mine, got to do. I applied on a whim mostly to prove to Marcus he was wrong. I wasn't wrong to be nervous. I failed the first attempt outright, didn't even get past the preliminary scores round. I spent the following summer studying orchestral scores until my eyes blurred, marking up used copies of symphonies with a system of colored pencils Marcus helped me design, sitting in Corinne's kitchen at 2 in the morning while she worked nights. The second attempt, I got in. Conducting fellowships don't lead anywhere fast, and nobody warns you how long the climb actually is. For nearly a decade after that fellowship, I built a career one unglamorous rung at a time. I spent 2 years as assistant conductor for a community youth orchestra that rehearsed in a middle school cafeteria, the smell of tater tots still hanging in the air during evening rehearsals. I spent 3 seasons as a guest cover conductor for a regional symphony, which mostly meant sitting in the audience with a score in my lap in case the actual conductor got sick, which happened exactly twice in 3 years. I spent another 3 seasons leading a small chamber ensemble that rehearsed in the basement of a converted church, where the radiator clanged loudly enough during winter rehearsals that we had to work around it. Mr. Alvarez, my old teacher, wrote me a letter every single year on the anniversary of my very first lesson with him, a habit he never explained, and I never asked him to stop. He never once asked why I hadn't ended up at that conservatory program all those years ago. Looking back, I think he'd already guessed the truth long before I found out myself and simply never said anything, out of some instinct to protect me from a piece of information he couldn't undo. Along the way, I lost auditions to conductors with better family connections and worse musical instincts. I sat across from more than one search committee that told me, in language vague enough to mean anything and specific enough that I understood exactly what they meant, that their orchestra wasn't quite ready for someone like me on the podium. There was one panel in particular, at a mid-sized regional symphony I'd wanted badly, where a committee member actually asked me, in front of the others, whether I thought I had the right temperament to hold a room of 60 musicians. I gave a calm, professional answer at the time. In the parking lot afterward, I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. I kept going anyway, mostly because the alternative was letting the decision my father made in that attic, the decision to throw away a letter instead of handing it to me, become the last word on the rest of my life. I refused to give him that. I hadn't spoken to my parents in nearly 6 years when my mother called out of nowhere on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a rehearsal break. Her voice was different from how I remembered it. Careful, almost rehearsed, like she'd practiced the call in the mirror beforehand. She told me the hardware store had lost its lease after the building it sat in finally sold to a developer, and that she and my father had fallen behind on the mortgage on the house I grew up in. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a regional newspaper had run a small feature on a local girl done good, a photo of me from a fellowship announcement 2 years earlier that a cousin had shown her after seeing it shared online. "We didn't realize you were doing so well," she said in a tone that was almost admiring, like it was a compliment aimed at both of us. Then, more quietly, in the voice she used to use when she wanted something from my father and didn't want to ask directly, "We were hoping maybe you could help us out, just until things get stable again." I sat with that for a long moment in the hallway outside the rehearsal room, listening to the muffled sound of the orchestra warming up on the other side of the door. What I felt wasn't quite anger. It was closer to a deep, familiar exhaustion, the kind that comes from being asked once again to solve a problem I hadn't caused. I told her I'd think about it and asked, instead of agreeing to anything on the phone, whether she and my father would be willing to come visit me in person so we could talk properly. She sounded relieved, like she'd braced herself for a much harder no. I didn't tell her why I wanted them to come in person, or what they would actually be walking into when they did. I called Mr. Alvarez before I called my parents back. He was retired by then, living 2 hours away in a small apartment near his daughter, and I asked him to come to opening night of my very first season as music director, not assistant conductor, not fellow, but the actual permanent conductor of a full professional orchestra. He was quiet on the phone for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he told me, in a voice that cracked slightly, that he'd wondered for 20 years whether he'd made a mistake pushing a kid from a hardware store family toward a life this hard. I told him he hadn't. He cried on the phone, which I had genuinely never once seen or heard him do in 14 years of knowing him. Then I called my parents back and told them I had 2 tickets waiting for them at Will Call for a performance in the city, and that afterward the 3 of us could sit down and talk properly about the house, the mortgage, all of it. I deliberately didn't tell them what kind of performance it was. I let them assume it was something small and forgettable, a polite obligation to sit through before getting to the real conversation they actually cared about. My mother said that sounded lovely and asked what she should wear. I told her something nice would be fine and left it at that. They arrived at the concert hall the way people arrive somewhere they don't feel they belong. My father wore an ill-fitting navy blazer he'd clearly bought specifically for the occasion, the tags probably still in his coat pocket. My mother clutched her purse against her stomach with both hands, the way she used to hold it at the mall when I was a kid, and she was worried about pickpockets. An usher walked them down the center aisle to seats in the 4th row. Dead center. Seats normally reserved for major donors and the immediate family of the orchestra's staff. I watched from a gap in the wings as my mother leaned over and whispered to my father that there must be some mistake with the tickets, that surely they belonged somewhere further back. He told her in the low, irritated voice I remembered from childhood to just sit down before someone noticed and moved them. The house lights dimmed. The orchestra tuned, that brief, chaotic swirl of sound settling slowly into a single held note. And then I walked out from the wings in concert black, baton in hand, into the kind of sustained applause that has absolutely nothing to do with who your parents think you are, and everything to do with who you actually became without them. I didn't look for their faces during the performance. I couldn't have found them in the dark even if I'd wanted to, and I didn't want to. I needed that hour and 40 minutes to belong entirely to the orchestra and to me, with no room left over for anyone in the fourth row. I found my parents afterward, in the moment I chose, in the lobby beside the donor wall. A wall where, as it happened, there was a large framed program from opening night hanging under glass, my name and title printed across the top in serif type. Music director and conductor, Odalis Marchetti. My father was standing directly in front of it when I walked up behind him, still in his concert clothes. He didn't say anything for a long time. Just kept looking back and forth between the framed program and me, like his eyes were trying to reconcile two facts that didn't fit together. My mother's hand was pressed flat against her chest, like she was trying to physically hold something in. "You conducted that," my father finally said. It wasn't really a question. He just needed to hear the words out loud from me to make it real. "I did," I told him. "I've been doing this for a long time, actually. You two just weren't watching." We didn't have the real conversation in the lobby under the donor wall with strangers in evening wear filing past us toward the coat check. I took my parents to a quiet diner 3 blocks from the hall. The kind of place where nobody recognizes a conductor once she's out of her concert dress and back in a cardigan. My father tried twice, early in the meal, to steer the conversation toward the house, the mortgage, what exactly I might be willing or able to do to help. Both times I told him we would absolutely get there, but first I needed him to sit and listen to something. I told him about the letter. I watched something shift in his face while I talked. Not surprise, because he already knew exactly what he'd done 20 years earlier, but the specific, squirming discomfort of hearing it described back to him in detail by the 16-year-old girl he'd taken it from, now sitting across a diner booth as a grown woman with a title on a program under glass. I told him I'd known the truth for 14 years, ever since that wedding, and had simply never brought it up because I didn't think he deserved the satisfaction of watching it upset me. I turned to my mother and told her I remembered every single recital she'd shown up late to, sliding into a seat near the exit doors, and everyone she hadn't shown up to at all when I used to watch the classroom door instead of my own bow hand, hoping. I told them both about Aunt Corinne, the sister they'd cut off, the woman who fed me and housed me and believed in a plan I hadn't even fully believed in myself, while they sat 2 states away, quietly assuming I'd fail on my own and eventually come home chastened. My mother said very quietly, staring at her coffee cup, that they'd only ever wanted a stable life for me, that they didn't know how else to want that for a child. I told her that stability and smallness aren't the same thing, and that in 20 years, neither of them had once asked me what I actually wanted before deciding, on my behalf, what was supposedly best for me. My father, to his credit, didn't argue the point. He said the store, the mortgage, the whole life he'd spent building, he'd always thought of it as something solid he was leaving behind for the family, and watching it slip out of his hands over the last year had made him realize, for the first time, that he'd never actually built anything that lasted the way I clearly had. It wasn't quite an apology. It was the first completely honest thing he'd said to me in over 20 years, and I let it sit there between us without rushing to fill the silence. I told them, as gently and as clearly as I could manage, that I wasn't going to pay off the mortgage. Not out of spite, and not to punish them for the letter, but because rescuing them from a debt they'd taken on with their eyes open wouldn't actually fix the underlying problem. And because I'd learned a long time ago, first from Corinne, later from Mr. Alvarez, later still from Marcus, that the people who dig you out too quickly are often the same people who taught you, without meaning to, not to trust your own hands in the first place. What I offered instead was smaller, and I think ultimately more honest. I told them I'd help them find a legitimate financial counselor and sit in on the first call if they wanted me there. I told them I wouldn't be co-signing anything. And I told them I'd start calling more than the twice a year we'd settled into by default, but on my own terms, at a pace slow enough to let something like trust actually rebuild instead of being declared back into existence over one dinner. My father looked disappointed, the exact same expression he used to wear when I was a kid, and didn't hand him the answer he'd already decided he wanted. But this time he didn't argue with me, didn't accuse me of being selfish, didn't invoke family the way he once had over a savings account that never existed in this version of my life but might as well have, given how familiar the shape of the demand felt. My mother reached across the sticky diner table, hesitated for a second like she wasn't sure she still had permission, and then actually took my hand. It was the first time I could remember her doing that since I was small enough to need help crossing a street. A few months after that dinner, Neil reached out to me for the first time in years, out of nowhere, the way my mother had. He'd finally taken over the hardware store lease at its new location, a smaller storefront 2 blocks from where the original had stood for 3 generations, and he asked, almost sheepishly, whether I'd come to the reopening. I went. Standing behind that new counter, ringing up a bag of nails for an elderly customer, Neil told me quietly that he used to envy how much attention Mr. Alvarez gave me after school, back when we were kids, because it meant somebody outside the family had decided I was worth the extra time. I told him I used to envy him for the opposite reason, that our parents had decided he was worth their attention without him ever having to earn it. First, we stood there for a minute, neither of us quite apologizing, both of us finally saying something true. Aunt Corinne still comes to every single opening night, sitting in the same seat every year, a seat I reserve for her permanently now regardless of who else asks for it. Marcus eventually left percussion behind almost entirely and moved into composing full-time. I get to premiere his pieces most seasons, which still feels like an enormous privilege every time it happens. Mr. Alvarez passed away 2 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, and the youth fellowship I started in his name, funded partly through the orchestra and partly out of my own pocket, has already sent 4 kids. From difficult, doubting households to conservatory auditions they would never have attempted without someone pushing them the way he once pushed me. My parents and I talk now occasionally carefully, the way you'd handle something you're still not entirely sure is fully repaired. They've never quite become the family I once wished for as a kid watching the classroom door during a recital, and at some point in the last couple of years I finally stopped needing them to become that. What I have instead is a life I built almost entirely out of a violin I found under Christmas decorations in an attic. A teacher who wrote me a letter every single year for 14 years running, an aunt who never once asked me to prove I deserved a spot on her couch, and a friend who heard a conductor standing inside me years before I ever heard it myself. If there's one thing I hope you take away from all of this, it's that the people who decide, early and often, that you're not worth investing in rarely end up getting the deciding vote in how your life actually turns out. Somebody threw my letter away once, quietly, in a kitchen trash can, thinking it was a small, forgettable decision. I built an entire life out of the space where that letter should have been. Whatever's been thrown away in your own story, by whoever did the throwing, you still, always, get to decide what grows there instead.